And in this session, we're going to have two papers, and then you'll have a chance for another break. But excitement. The immediate excitement being Ruth Barnes. Yeah. Ruth is the Thomas Jaffe Curator of Indo-Pacific Art at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven. That's just up the coast, for those of you who are not quite aware of this. Sorry, I was at Harvard for 20 years. She received her DPhil from the University of Oxford. Her doctoral dissertation was published as the Ikat Textiles of La Malera. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Good, thank you. A study of an Eastern Indonesian weaving tradition. She's written extensively on Indonesian weaving and related art forms. From 1990 to the end of 2009, she was textile curator at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, where she, and I say that name with a certain reverence, where she focused on early Indian Ocean trade networks. She published Indian block-printed textiles in Egypt, the Newbury collection in the Ashmolean Museum, and co-authored with Rosemary Krill and Stephen Cohen, Trade, Temple and Court, Indian Textiles from the Tapi collection in 2002. She co-edited with Mary Kallenberg 500 Years of Indonesian Textiles, which received the Textile Society of America's R.L. Shep Award. In 2010, she left the Ashmolean and moved to Yale, where she is now senior curator of the University Art Gallery's newly endowed Department of Indo-Pacific Art. She is going to talk to us today about Without Cloth We Cannot Marry, the making and meaning of textiles in Eastern Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Barnes.
Thank you so much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful occasion. Omila, I'm so pleased on your behalf for that wonderful, fantastic exhibition you put together, and I'm very, very honored to be invited to participate in today's workshop. Thank you. Now, everyone knows that when you make things, you have to follow certain conditions and mechanical steps to achieve the desired result. As humans developed skills to build shelters, construct containers for storage and cooking, work metals and clay, and make textiles for clothing and display, they learned to perfect their understanding of the materials they used. They also invented tools that facilitate working these materials. This is part of the history of human ingenuity. But the objects thus made also become an aspect of the social life of the culture they are part of, and the role they take on may then become reflected in how they are made. The material and the imaginary world inevitably inform each other. In this representation, I want to explore the cultural aspects of textiles in some Eastern Indonesian societies, where I think I can demonstrate that the making and the meaning of textiles are very closely connected. My geographic focus is East Flores and the islands immediately to the east, usually referred to as the Solar Islands. And here you have the wider map of Indonesia, and then, whoops, in this inset here, you have the geographical region here that I'm going to talk about. Maritime Southeast Asia has a long and very rich history of textile production, going back more than 4,000 years. Cloth was woven not only for utilitarian dress, but also for ceremonial and prestige items and for their functions. Based on archaeological and linguistic evidence, it is quite certain that the Austronesian-speaking ancestors of the current population of Indonesia had their origins in East Asia and moved into Southeast Asia from Southeast China or Taiwan by 2500 BCE at the very latest. There is no doubt that the knowledge of weaving technology was shared by early Austronesian settlers, as the loom used by the Aborigines of Taiwan and the body tension loom common in Indonesia and parts of Malaysia are very closely related. The most rudimentary version of the body tension or backstrap loom is a relatively simple weaving device, with its essential parts being the warp beam, here at the top, the cloth beam, this part here, the heddle that separates alternate warp threads, this part here, sticks that help create the shed, the weaver's sword, of course, to beat in the weft as well. There are also two additional but external parts which are not shown in this particular diagram, but you'll see it in a moment in another drawing of the particular type of loom that I'm very familiar with. These external parts are the weft stick with the weft wound around it, which is inserted into the warp and then beaten with the weaver's sword, and a foot brace which helps the weaver to regulate the tension, to manipulate the shed. Throughout the region, textile making is associated with the female side of society, as it is true for most, if not all, of Southeast Asia. It is women's work, and from an early age, girls become involved with the process. They may start spinning when they are no more than 4 or 5 years old, and they will slowly be trained to assist their mothers, aunts, and older sisters with all stages of textile production. The strong association of women with textile making often is linked metaphorically with their fertility and childbearing capacity. The body tension loom uses a continuous warp thread. See that here? You also can just make it out in this photograph of the loom that this woman is using. It uses a continuous warp thread which may become a metaphor for the continuity of life. Life cycle events frequently require an elaborate exchange of gifts, especially at weddings and funerals. Typically, this involves presentations of textiles that come from the woman's family or her wider lineage or clan. As a weaver friend of mine said in the village of Lamlera on southern Lambata, when I asked her about whether she thought that the weaving of textiles may actually be endangered, may disappear in the village, she said, no, this is not possible. Without cloth, we cannot marry. The cloth presented on these occasions, when it comes to the exchange following a marriage, the cloths presented then are often prescribed in color and in patterns. And in the latter, the patterns are often linked to a particular lineage. Let me start with the loom. The earliest version of the body tension loom closely follows the measurements of the weaver's body. The continuous warp stretches no further than the distance between the woman's lap and her outstretched feet. And you can see that to some degree, even still in evidence with this loom that is in use from East Flores all the way to the island of Alo. in parts of Timor as well. It combines the foot brace. Now in this part here in the diagram, or you see it here in this loom setup. It combines the foot brace with the warp beam as it appears in the miniature, a representation of weavers on the lid of a bronze cowrie container from as early as the 2nd or 1st century BCE, from the Dian culture tomb from southwestern China. It also appears with much more attention given to detail in this bronze sculpture of a weaver dated by thermal luminescence testing to the 2nd half of the 6th century CE. The sculpture places this particular sculpture's place of manufacture is not known, but it was kept as a sacred heirloom in a clan house in East Flores until the early 1980s. It then left the community under rather obscure, one may even say very unfortunate circumstances, and it is now in the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. The figure, by the way, is about 25 centimeters tall, and its width is about the same. The same version of the foot-braced body tension loom was still in use in Hainan in the early 20th century. The loom in use in the region of eastern Indonesia, under discussion here, has an uncanny similarity to the foot-braced version, though. Although foot brace and warp beam are separate, they are actually held together at the same distance from the cloth beam. That is the beam that is in the woman's lap. As both foot brace and warp beam are tied to the same pair of small upright posts. This type of loom is clearly just one step removed from a foot braced version. And it poses the intriguing possibility that the Eastern Indonesian loom found in Flores and to the east of it is surviving evidence for an early weaving technology. We may even infer from it that textile making may have been present in Eastern Indonesia from the earliest arrival of loom weaving in maritime Southeast Asia. Textile making in East Flores and the islands east of it, the islands Adonara, Solor, and Lembata, have been recorded since the early 20th century, when the German ethnologist Ernst Vater and his wife Hannah surveyed the region and collected on behalf of the Ethnographic Museum in Frankfurt. You see Ernst Vater's wife Hannah here, in a group photograph with women showing different ways of wearing the tubular skirt, the sarong. And on the right, you see a photograph taken by either Ernst Vater or his wife Hannah, taken in East Flores. My own research in the area started in the 1970s, and I continue to visit the islands almost annually. We have a relatively good record, therefore, of the textiles made locally. Nowadays, people usually wear Western clothes for daily dress, but this only happened over the last 2 decades or so. Prior to that time, locally woven tubular skirts, the sarong, were worn by both men and women. And in addition to weaving for daily wear, women also wove, and they still weave today, sarongs that have primarily a ceremonial purpose as an essential part of the gift exchange that occurs at every wedding, but also in weaving for funeral presentations. As mentioned above, the loom is used to weave textiles with a continuous warp. This means that the warp is set up as a continuous loop to the full width to be woven. And you can really see it here. This is the continuous warp winding around. The weaving moves along in the weaver's lap, and every 10 centimeters or so she will unfasten the cloth, which is clipped into the breastbeam, right here. She will unfasten it and move it along slightly in order to create a new warp space for the unwoven threads, and then continue weaving. Eventually, the start of the woven textile will appear at the warp beam and move on close to the shed stick and the heddle. And you can see that in the exhibition's ceremonials, very narrow, small ceremonial cloths from Bali with simple warp stripes. Now, eventually, at this point, when the weaving is virtually completed, but the last part of the weft cannot be inserted because the shed and heddle sticks actually get in the way of completing that on the warp, the cloth is usually taken off the loom. The remaining open warp section is cut and sewn together. Two identical cloths are usually made up together into a long tubular skirt. You see this here, this woman holding one of those. However, if the cloth is to be used as a bridewell cloth, part of the ceremonial exchange, the open warp threads are not allowed to be cut. And you can just... Sorry?
Could you repeat that again, please?
Right. If the cloth is to be used as a bridewell cloth, part of the ceremonial exchange, the open warp threads that are part of the completed cloth, the open warp threads are not allowed to be cut. You see that here. This cloth is sewn together from two sections, but the seam has not been closed. The continuous warp represents the lifeline and fertility that the bride brings into her husband's clan. To cut it would have disastrous consequences. As we shall see, this is not the only instance when making and meaning are brought in concordance. Textile design among the Lamaholot focuses primarily on ikat. Supplementary weft and warp and weft stripes are also used, but the highest quality of decoration is based on ikat, the resist dye process that is found throughout Indonesia and of which we see some very fine examples in the current Bali exhibition here at the Bart Center. I now want to talk a bit about the process as it is done among the Lamaholot. My specific information comes from the fishing village and weaving community of Lamalera on the south coast of Lembata. And you see the beach here with the boat sheds, and this is the lower community. The village stretches up, going up the hillside. Let me start with a brief outline of the technical aspect of ikat. Unlike tie-dye, that is in Indonesian or Malay called plangi or tritik, where the design is tied into the woven cloth, for ikat the pattern is tied into the warp, weft, or in rare instances, both warp and weft threads prior to weaving the cloth. For simplicity's sake, I will describe only the warp ikat process here. The continuous warp that is to be tied with patterns is set up on a wooden frame. If you look closely at an ikat textile, you will notice that the entire pattern is built up from small squares, like, see that here, you see it here. These are all tiny little squares that build up the entire design. Each square represents one tied knot. As you will see, each knot covers a small group of warp threads. You can see that best, for example, I think here, or in this cross section here, or in these diagonal lines. You can see that each little square is made up of a certain number of threads. This means that as the warp threads are set up on the ikat frame, they are divided into small bands or skeins, each made up of a specific number of warp threads, which always is 6 in the village of Lamlera and throughout the Lamaholot region that I'm familiar with. These little bundles here contain 6 warp threads each. Prior to the start of the dyeing process, the skeins are divided in half, as we see here with this line. Here they are divided in half and then pulled together. So this part and this number 5 here is combined with this number 5. I divide them into A and B. This one is combined with this one, and so on. The skeins are brought together, and the corresponding ones are tied together with a single string that keeps the skeins in place. As each skein also has an upper and a lower warp, a lower part because it is a circular warp, this string holds together 4 times 6 warp threads. The knot that will be tied to build up the pattern, therefore, will cover all 24 warp threads, 4 times 6. It means that each ikat knot reserves with one tie 4 times the same small design element. Once the pattern has been completed, it has been gathered and tied 4 times. This is, of course, very efficient for producing regular design, but it also makes for symmetry of the overall textile, as pattern bands are repeated at both ends of the sarong. Now, moving on from the single unit to the wider picture of the actual design. The ikat pattern is tied into a band made up of a prescribed number of skeins or bundles. As you see here, this is the entire width of the ikat, this particular ikat pattern. This is a much smaller one. Each pattern has a width that is appropriate to it, and it is not, and not to use the correct width shows that the weaver actually doesn't really know what she's doing. She's not skilled enough. And weavers constantly check each other's cloth, actually, especially when it comes to the exchange of textiles on ceremonial occasions. They count the numbers, the widths of the patterns, to make sure that it is the correct width. The widths that we find range from a width of 5 to one of 15, 17, 19, or more. You may notice that I mentioned only odd number of pattern bands. The number of ikat skeins which make up one pattern has to be uneven. Now let's look at this very narrow one. Each one here at the border, you have something that's like a gauge that allows you to count the width of the pattern. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now if you count this, I forgot what the width now is, but it is, I think it's over 21. So making a textile, specifically a textile with ikat patterns, involves a constant back and forth between even and odd numbers. The ikat skeins that make up the pattern hold 6 warp threads, as I mentioned at the beginning. The number 6 is made up of a combination of 2 times 3 or 3 times 2. It combines the odd with the even. The warp stripes or ikat bands, which decorate the 2-panel woman's sarong, are always uneven in number. Although the ikat bands and warp stripe in a woman's sarong are symmetrically arranged, with prominence given to the wider borders, here and here, are repeated up here and there, still this bands you find here will be symmetrical, will be mirror symmetric to patterns that are found in this part. But there is always, where the seam is, there is the addition of one single band, which makes the entire arrangement actually and gives it an odd number of pattern bands. The most prestigious Bridewell cloth, a 3-panel textile, has 2 outer panels that are symmetrical, with an uneven number of pattern bands and stripes in each, but when you combine the 2, of course, you get an even number. However, by adding the large central panel, the uneven number is again established. This concern with odd and even numbers permeates other aspects of material culture in the East Flores and Solo region. It is found in house building. The spars which form the sloping framework of the roof must be uneven on each of the 4 sides. Here, 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 and there. The boats built in the fishing village of Lamalera, southern Lembata, have an uneven number of internal sections. These sections are marked off here by these cross beams. It always has to have, a boat has to have 11 such sections. When constructing a bamboo platform, the usual place for people to sit down together when a larger gathering takes place, when constructing this platform, the slats that fill the seating area must be uneven. Except on one occasion, the occasion of the funeral, when the platform is built to hold the deceased, the corpse. Then the slats have to be even in number. Now here I want to quote the linguist Goris Keraf, who himself came from Lamalera and was professor of linguistics at the Universitas Indonesia in Jakarta. He, speaking of boat building in Lamalera and the importance of odd versus even numbers, he said, I quote him, "Odd numbers express a form of life, a continuous dynamic. This presents an important factor in the attitude of life of the people of Lamalera. Even numbers indicate that everything has been finished, is complete. In other words, he states that odd numbers are associated with life, even numbers with completion, which also means death. Returning to the textiles, their making demonstrate this concern with contrasting odd and even. Odd and even numbers have a metaphorical meaning that refers to life and death, to transition and to completion. Now, one final aspect of textile making I want to consider. It concerns the predominant colors chosen. In my field research, there was never, ever any question when discussing precise hues and shades of dyes that the weavers can make very fine distinctions. They're perfectly good at it. They can define these verbally. Yet despite the linguistic capacity in the local language to distinguish between slight variations in color, the categorical color classification of cloth is the triad of white, red, and black. White, the undyed cotton, is associated with the spirit world and the ancestors. White cotton pellets, here in this basket, a priest's basket, white cotton pellets are part of any ceremony that evokes the ancestors. Red and black have a less clearly defined meaning in the Flores Solo region. The predominant color of Brightwell cloth is red, except in the easternmost region of Kedang, where the cloth has to be dyed with dark indigo, considered to be black. In East Flores and the Solar Islands, red, referred to as meang in the local language, has a superlative meaning, referring to extraordinary, golden, strong, and healthy. It can even be a reference to divine power. God is spoken of as meang, meaning red, shiny, and golden. It is the color, therefore, of the textile the bride's lineage offers to the grooms at or following a wedding. The situation is quite different in Kedang, however. There, red is associated with witchcraft, with warfare, with bloodshed. It is also associated with moral wickedness. Black, a dark blue indigo, is the appropriate color of the Brightwell cloth. And I'm talking here about the solid bands of color that are used in the making of the textile, not the colored bands in between. Kedang cloths include these fine bands of that include red as well. What matters are the solid bands. They defined the color of the textile. Black is associated with the physical aspect of the living community. At a funeral, a black cloth is cut apart into as many strips as there are surviving siblings of the deceased. This ritually separates the living from the dead and confirms their position very much in this world. Formerly, a person's teeth were blackened on reaching adulthood. Earthenware pots, coconut cups, and wooden plates were only considered strong enough for use once they had been stained with charcoal. The Kedang preference for black cloth led to an interesting trade transition. Well into the 20th century, weaving was actually prohibited in Kedang. And even today, no loom enters the old village, the ceremonial center of each community. And yet, the Kedang did not go naked. Instead, they traded for their cloth from coastal weaving villages. Their preferred source of cloth especially for their bright wool cloth, was the neighboring Iliape region, one of the most prolific and accomplished weaving centers on the island of Lembata. And here you see the view of the Iliape Peninsula from the mountain hamlet of in Kedang, where I spent my first time in Indonesia many, many decades ago. We had our first house there, a little bamboo hut, pretty much in this location, with that view, which was quite wonderful. It also was a difficult location, actually, because the spring was half an hour away, and the market was even further away. Anyway, this shows the peninsula of Iliape. Iliape weavers produced a red bright wool cloth for their own use, but when they made cloth for the Kedang, they had to follow that region's color restrictions. To conclude, I hope to have shown that making and meaning are indeed closely related, and it can be most revealing to observe closely the process of making, as it teaches us much about the social role objects may have in the communities that produce them, or in those that use them. These may not always be identical, but that is an entirely different topic of investigation to be reserved for another time. Thank you.
So we have time just for one or two questions for Dr. Barnes. Yes.
Yeah, this is more just as a comment. I also went to Lembata back in the mid-'80s several times, and found as I went up into the mountains, your comment about the women doing these and not cutting the sarong, their problem was, the way I understood it, was there were no men left around. All the guys had left to go to Jakarta to find money. So they had all these great women around weaving these pieces that were still unbroken, but no men to marry. So it was just a unique problem for that area because it was pretty economically
difficult. That is true indeed. The issue of what is called merantau in Indonesia, where communities are depleted of their young men, was indeed a problem. We observed that certainly in the 80s and 90s. To some degree, there was a return of many of these men when many of them had gone to East Timor, for example, when East Timor had its referendum and then separated from Indonesia. Many of those people came back. The unrest in Ambon in I think that was in the late 90s, had a similar result. People actually did return to their communities. So I would say in the last 15 years, the position has become a little bit more positive again for local women.
One more. Yes.
I was in La Valera, and I was following the whales. Did the women ever weave the whales that the men went after into their textiles?
They weave the manta ray. Mm-hmm. I asked them about the weaving of whales. And they said, well, the manta ray has a beautiful shape that can be represented very effectively in ikat. The whale is big, and it doesn't have so many clearly defined parts like the wings and the stingtail that the ray has. So they did not find it as an ikat pattern very attractive. But they were actually, they let themselves be inspired by this question that I posted them, and they tried out on cloth made for tourists. They put the whale on that.
Good. Well, I wish I'd been one of those tourists. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.